Welcome to tonight's webinar. My name is Sam Anderson, and I'm thrilled you could be here with us. Tonight's webinar is all about taking exams. Whether a PSAT, an SAT, or an ACT, you'll likely be taking some standardized tests this year in addition to your usual school tests, midterms, and finals. Being a good test taker can help students distinguish themselves and excel. We'll talk about what makes a good test taker, as well as provide some specific information about the SAT and ACT. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to tonight's speaker. Jesse PIZARRO is a C2 teacher trainer working with C2 teachers across the country. Jesse attended Yale University, earning a degree in political science with distinction. After spending over a year in New York working in finance, he returned to Southern California and began his career with C2. Since then, Jesse has tutored students in a variety of subjects, helped many seniors navigate the college application process to gain admission to their dream schools, and even runs C2's college essay review service, reading and connecting on hundreds of essays every year. We are very excited to have Jesse with us tonight to share his insights and experiences and present to you Test Taking 101. Jesse?
All right, thank you so much, Sam, for that lovely introduction, and welcome everyone to Test Taking 101. But as Sam said, my name is Jesse PIZARRO. I am a teacher trainer here at C2 Education, where I work with a ton of our teachers. We spend a lot of time in training, not surprisingly, on things like the SAT and the ACT and how to instruct them, what's on them, and kind of what matters, right? Because quite frequently our teachers, they're a few years removed from having taken that exam or having studied for it or anything like that. So part of my job is to keep current on those tests, how to prepare for them, and how to sort of help students prepare for exams more broadly. Because test taking is a skill, and it is a skill that matters. It is a skill that if you hone it, if you improve at it, if you know sort of what and how to do well on exams, you will get better scores, and ideally you'll get those sort of dream scores that we talked about that will get you into those dream schools that Sam was mentioning. So that's what we're going to do today, right? We're going to start by talking about preparation for exams in general. And then we'll zoom in specifically on kind of the two elephants in the room here, right? The SAT and the ACT. In a little bit of a preview here, I'll tell you right now that one of our tips in terms of preparing for the exams is to know the exams, is to know what the content of those exams is, because if you don't know that, you're not going to be able to prepare very well or very intelligently. And so we'll go through a lot of sort of what is tested specifically on the SAT and the ACT. We'll kind of compare the two and give a sense for which exam might be better for which kind of student. We'll also give some additional tips as we go through the SAT and ACT sections. As Sam mentioned, if you have questions at any point during the presentation this evening, feel free to submit them using your GoToWebinar control panel. We'll try to answer as many as we can during the presentation itself, and if there's time at the end, I will try and take a few more questions then as well. So with that, let's jump into it and talk about exam preparation. So we've got four big sort of points when it comes to preparing for exams like these. First one, you know your dates, right? You got to know when your exams are going to be. Now that can mean something very specific when it comes to something like the SAT or the ACT, right? You know exactly what date, what time you're going to be taking that test. But that also applies for something like school, right? Your teachers may not always tell you, way in advance exactly when all your tests over the course of a semester are going to be. But one, you should know when your midterms are going to be and when your finals are going to be. And two, part of your job as a student is to start to predict these things, is to try to get a sense for the fact that, hey, units in my math class generally last about 2 weeks. And so we pretty much have a test every other Friday. And even though my teacher hasn't told me explicitly this week that we're going to have a test on Friday, I know it because we always have a test on, the second Friday of the month, or something along those lines, right? So being able to sort of think critically about the schedule of your course or of your class, as well as knowing the actual printed and published dates of your standardized exams is important. It also matters because particularly when it comes to the SAT or the ACT, some folks will want to take these exams more than once, right? If you're not happy with your score, it's very possible that you're going to want to sit for the exam a second time, particularly if you do some preparation. You do some additional studying in between them. And so when I say know your dates, and this kind of feeds into the point we'll make in just a minute here about having a plan, right? we want you to have a plan for preparing for any given exam, right? This is my SAT study plan, or this is how I'm going to prepare for my AP US History final. But there's also a sense of planning more broadly, right? Planning your exam calendar, particularly when it comes to standardized exams as you go through high school. Especially for those of you who are juniors or seniors this year, right, where you're trying to balance things like your SATs with things like SAT subject tests that you also need to complete in order to complete your college applications and be well positioned for admissions. You know, you got to know that if you're planning, if December is your fallback SAT date, well, then it can't also be the date that you're planning to take a bunch of SAT subject tests, right? And likewise with the ACT and stuff like that. So making sure that you have a sense not only for when you're going to take the SAT, but what you're going to do if you get a score that you're really happy with, what you're going to do if you get a score that you're not very happy with, right? And sort of having a plan for each of those potential eventualities is going to be crucial. As you can see here, in terms of the standardized exam dates for this fall and into next spring, see pretty much both tests are happening monthly from October through December, with a small switch from, oh, and I apologize for the misspelling on September there. Nope, not a misspelling, we're okay. You can see that the SAT basically happens monthly from October through December, whereas the ACT starts a little bit earlier. Their first administration is in September, and then they have October and December dates as well. Those December dates are, generally speaking, going to be the final cutoff dates for scores that you want to submit to this year's college application process. In other words, if you are a current senior and you are planning to still take the SAT or the ACT and submit that score as part of your college applications, this may vary a little bit from school to school, but as a general rule, those December administrations of the SAT and ACT are going to be the final possible date that you could take those exams and still have those scores considered for this year's admissions process. All right, so we will get into much greater depth momentarily here about the content of the SAT and the ACT and kind of comparing them. But the more that you know about both what you're going to be tested on and how you are going to be tested on it, the better, right? And again, a lot of times this means using a little bit of prediction, right? Or sort of understanding your teachers. One of the things that I used to do in high school quite frequently was a couple of friends and I, in our calculus class, would guess what the sort of challenge problem at the end of the exam was going to be, or what it was going to be like, right? And quite often, if we sat there and thought about it and thought through the challenge problems that our teacher had assigned for homework, or looked ahead to the next chapter in the book to see sort of what the extension of the various concepts we were working on, that week might be, we were often able to predict, not perfectly, not exactly, but to some extent, how we would be tested, right? What the format of the exam would look like, which portions or which concepts would be tested in the multiple choice section, and which would be sort of more in the free response section. I would say this goes even further for things like English and history, where a lot of times you should be able to predict at least some of the essay prompts that you will be given. Maybe not word for word, but again, you should be able to predict like what the essay topic is going to be, or what some potential essay prompts might be, right? And if you can do that, well, one, that means you can study a lot more in a lot more targeted fashion, right? A lot more pointedly than just sort of trying to review literally everything. Another point that goes along with sort of knowing the exams is once you know the format of the exam, you can practice under test-like conditions, right? Particularly when it comes to the ACT or the SAT in general, I don't think it's wise to sit down and do just one section. If you're trying to do a practice exam, then do a practice exam, right? Students sometimes get tired. Students sometimes struggle to maintain their focus and concentration levels for the full, 3 to 4 hours that these exams can take to switch back and forth from subject to subject. All of that stuff can pose additional challenges to students that you should therefore be practicing and preparing for. Likewise with timing, right? Particularly if you're the kind of student that struggles with time limits, with sort of working quickly enough on exams, practicing under those same exact test-like conditions with that clock ticking away over your shoulder is going to be very, very valuable. Avoid only taking practice tests. We'll get into that a little bit more in depth later, along with what we mean by know your math schedule. But the basic idea there is just that, again, you have to know the content. Once you understand the content of these exams, you can sort of match that up with what you've already learned in school to help get a sense for what you need to learn, what additional stuff you might need to learn before you actually take these exams, because you certainly don't want to take an exam where you haven't been taught the material that's going to be covered on it. So make a study plan, right? This is an important thing that C2 does for virtually every student that comes in, right? We are constantly creating and iterating and adjusting these for our students in conjunction with their parents and with the student themselves, with our center directors and with the students' teachers. To me, one of the more valuable things that C2 can help with, because we've seen a gazillion students, right? We've helped students go from C's to A's in this class and that class. We've helped students improve this many points on the SAT or the ACT, right? And we understand what it takes, how long it's likely to take, and specifically what kinds of exercises and activities are likely to produce those results. And one of the things that we do at C2 very specifically is, we plan out what concepts, what ideas, what topics we're going to engage with each class. We don't simply hand out practice test after practice test after practice test, right? Again, going back to what we were just talking about. We have a deliberate plan, and then we use practice tests to see how well that plan is working and to adjust it, right? So we don't just take practice tests constantly. It can also be depressing to take practice tests constantly because it will be hard to determine if you're making a lot of progress, right? Even if you are working hard and doing well, it's not a guarantee that your test scores are going to go up, each and every day, or with a 2-day interval between exams or something like that. And so that's why the best study plans include a mix of targeted review as well as the occasional practice exams. It's also important to find ways to measure your progress beyond simply the results of those practice tests, right? Because again, those practice tests, while they're useful, they can also be a little bit noisy, right? There's a margin of error that's built into every single SAT. Occasionally, one will come out that's a little bit harder, a little bit easier, or you just had a bad day in your Barron's book or whatever. And you don't want to tie your entire self-esteem or sense of progress to the idea that your score has to go up literally every day. Of course, in the long run, we do want your score to go up, and it's important that it does. If it's not, that's a sign that you may need to adjust your plan or something isn't working. But on the week-to-week or even day-to-day basis, right, it's important to find things that you can sort of be proud of or be happy with, right? Like working through a given chapter in a review book, or mastering a given concept or idea on the exam, as opposed to just, did this number get bigger? So this is another aspect of the study plan, and one that students often struggle with, right? Which is to target your weaknesses. And this is unpleasant, right, for a lot of students. It's not fun a lot of the time to sit there and work on stuff that you struggle with. It feels a lot better to know the answer right away, or to perceive it as easy, or to feel really smart as you work through and circle the correct answers on your practice test or on your worksheet or your review materials or what have you. But of course, you're not going to make nearly as much progress. Your score is not going to increase nearly as much if you get a little bit faster at questions that you're already getting correct, right? The biggest score gains, the biggest jumps come when you start getting questions correct that you would have previously left blank or gotten incorrect, which of course is the same thing on most standardized tests, right? Including the SAT and the ACT that don't feature guessing penalties. Of course, in order to target your weaknesses, you have to actually identify them. And that's where practice exams can be really, really helpful, particularly taking an initial practice exam before you kind of even design your study plan. Whether you do that at C2 or through the College Board's, kind of free materials that are available there, through a past exam that you've taken in school, through the Khan Academy, free materials that are available online, or some other way, right? One of your goals should be to be able to go through all the different subscores that will show up on the SAT, right? All the different sort of labels of concepts and types of questions, and know, is this a question type that I tend to excel at? Is this a question type that I tend to struggle at? Or somewhere in the middle, right? And if it's one that you struggle at, that's a very good sign to build that as a review topic specifically, not just in general under the umbrella of math, but no, I need to review specifically, triangle properties, or I need to review specifically parallelism as a grammar concept. And learning the concept and then practicing the concept before you go back to sort of take another practice test and see if you kind of integrated it into your body of knowledge is the best way to make progress. So that's why we recommend, understanding your score reports. We have, I think, a couple webinars on that that you can access on demand in our webinar library. We'll also be doing, additional ones throughout the winter and into the spring. But looking at things like your sub-scores and your cross-test scores can be really valuable in the sense of allowing you to sort of diagnose specifically for yourself, what am I good at and what do I need to work on? So those are some very general study tips, but I do think they are incredibly helpful for a student that is otherwise, that's well-intentioned, but doesn't necessarily have a lot of direction in terms of how to prepare for these exams. But of course, one of the big and important things there was just know the exams, right? You have to understand the content. You have to know what you're going to be tested on in order to prepare for it well. So we're going to spend some time now going through both the SAT and the ACT section by section and talking about that content. Like I said, we'll also pop up some study tips that are more specific to the exams themselves as we go through this. So probably know this already, but it's worth reiterating. The ACT gives you a score out of 36 on 4 different sections: English, math, reading, and science. They take the average of those 4 scores. That's your overall ACT score. It's a very simple calculation. There's not a lot of fancy adjustments or anything like that. Again, they take your score in each of the 4 sections and average it. There's also an essay on which you will get a score out of 12 if you choose to write it. It is considered optional. And then there are a couple of other sub-scores that will show up on your ACT score report. One is called an ELA score. This is just the average of your English, reading, and writing scores. And then there's a STEM score that is the average of your math and science scores. In general, the sub-scores aren't a big deal because, when it comes to like colleges and stuff like that, when it comes to designing a study plan and understanding your strengths and weaknesses, of course, they can be useful for determining that. But when it comes to what people who are going to evaluate you based on these exams care about, they care about those top line scores, right? They care about the score out of 1600 on the SAT. They care about the score out of 36 on the ACT. Reason for that being that if colleges or college admissions officers want to know more about how good you are at science or how good of a mathematician you are or something like that, they're going to have lots of other better data available to them than an ACT sub-score, right? They're much more likely to look at an SAT subject test score, an AP exam, even a grade from a school class is going to give them a lot better sense for those specific skills. So when it comes to these basic, these sort of first level exams, right? The SAT, the ACT, try to maximize that overall top line score. The first section that students will encounter on the ACT is the English section. It is almost identical to the SAT English section, to the corresponding section on the SAT. And so when it comes to students that are trying to choose between these 2 exams or aren't certain which exam is a better fit for them, this isn't the section to consider, right? This is not a good section to spend a lot of time worrying about because, again, it's almost identical to what you're going to have to do on the SAT. So no matter which test you take, you're going to have to do this stuff. You're going to have a pretty even split between questions that are sort of your pure grammar mechanics type questions, right? Things about commas and sentence structure and grammar and stuff like that. And then there are questions that are more about what makes for good writing as opposed to strictly what makes for correct writing. What order of these sentences is going to make the paragraph most convincing, or what order of these paragraphs is going to make the passage as a whole most convincing. You'll see questions like that where it's not to say that one order is strictly wrong, or that that you couldn't imagine putting it in that order, but that other orders are better, right? Those second types of questions, the rhetorical skills type questions, tend to be a little bit more challenging for most students. But again, you can certainly practice them specifically. You can get better at those types of questions specifically. don't neglect them, right? And sometimes students, particularly students that find rhetorical skills questions initially very, very challenging, will sometimes neglect them because they will think they're overly subjective, right? Whereas grammar rules are objective. This is the rule, and therefore this sentence is either correct or it's not. Sometimes the rhetorical skills types questions can feel a little bit subjective to students who don't totally understand what's going on with them. I promise you they're not very subjective. If you submitted those questions to lots and lots of English teachers, I promise you they would all answer very, very similarly, if not identically. That tells you that it's not just random or made up or something like that. There is real stuff being tested there, but it can be a challenge. It can be a little bit harder to study for because it is not quite so black and white. So it's something that you shouldn't neglect, and if anything, you should probably spend a little bit more time studying for that than the pure grammar, assuming that you have mastered the grammar or you feel comfortable with it. Second section on the ACT is the math section, and I say that second section quite deliberately. The order of sections on the ACT is always the same. You will always get these four sections in this order. And when it comes to the math, we can see that there's plenty of algebra represented on the ACT. That is quite similar to the SAT. There's a lot of algebra on the SAT as well. However, we see one of the major differences between the two exams here in the math section, which is how much geometry are you likely to be tested on this test. The ACT has way more geometry than the SAT does, and that should impact both your choice of exam potentially, as well as the way in which you study for that exam, right? If you liked geometry, if you were good at geometry, if you felt comfortable in geometry, particularly on the parts of geometry that other people didn't like, right? Maybe you liked proofs or you enjoyed them or they made sense to you in some specific way. That's a pretty good reason to potentially lean ACT. I wouldn't necessarily make my decision based on that single factor alone, but it is a good, it's a good indicator, right? It's a good thing that sort of might be pushing you in the ACT direction. Now, the SAT doesn't have nearly as much geometry. It does have a bunch of what they call passport to advanced math or passport to higher level math or something like that. The basic idea is that the math on the SAT kind of goes up to a higher level than does the ACT. You won't find very many questions on the ACT that folks would call pre-calculus, whereas that is definitely represented on the SAT. So if that's something that you're more comfortable with, right, that might be a reason to lean SAT when it comes to making this choice. Third section on the ACT is the reading section. Here you will always get 4 passages, well, 4 sets of questions, let's say, although one of those 4 passages might be a pair of passages, a dual passage, as it were. And the passages will always be of these types in this order, right? 1 prose fiction, 1 humanities, 1 social science, and 1 natural science passage. So far, incredibly similar to the SAT. The SAT has maybe not exactly 1 of each of these types, but it does have a pretty wide diversity of passage types that fall into, broadly speaking, these 4 categories. The types of questions that you're going to be asked on the 2 exams are quite similar. And so again, this wouldn't be the sort of section to compare when you're thinking about which of these exams is a better fit for me, right? The one difference really is that the ACT gives you pretty decently less time per question than the SAT does, right? You have under a minute per question on the ACT, and that, and you also have to read the passages, which for some students can be quite the challenge. The 4th section on the ACT is the science section. And this is the section that students are probably in general the least enamored of having to work on, or it is the section that sort of drives the most students away from wanting to take the ACT. And I think that's partly a misconception, because I think a lot of times students who don't think of themselves as particularly good at science or as liking science very much will sort of choose to avoid the ACT thinking, well, it's got a science section. I don't like science, so therefore I shouldn't take that test. And I think that sort of thinking is based on a misconception, which is that the ACT science section tests science, right? So if I didn't do well in my biology class, or I wasn't a big fan of physics or something like that, then maybe I shouldn't be taking this exam that has this section. And that's not like a silly thing to think, but I do think that the ACT science section is much, much more about things like applied graph reading and logical reasoning than it is about knowing, the specific steps in aerobic respiration or some number off the periodic table or something like that. In general, on the ACT science section, if they are going to test you where some scientific knowledge is required, they're going to provide that for you in the problem itself. The test is much more about, do you understand the scientific method? Do you understand what it means to sort of control a variable or test for a different one? Can you read graphs and interpret the results, particularly in the context of an experimental description or an experimental dispute or something along those lines? And so that's the first sort of issue, right? Is that it's not really a science test, at least in the way that I think of, and I think most students think of a science test. The other thing is that students think that, well, okay, fine, that's all fair and good, Jesse, but guess what? The SAT doesn't have a science section, so I'm still taking that. And that is technically true, right? There is no section on the SAT that is labeled science. But there is a sub-score, technically a cross-test score, that gets printed on your SAT score report that says, analysis in science. Well, if there's no science on the SAT, then how do they get that score? And the reason is that there is very similar questions, or there are very similar questions on the SAT to the ACT science section. Now, again, they're not collected into their own section. They're not called the science section per se, but students are required to read and interpret graphs throughout the SAT. There are graphs in the grammar section. There are graphs in the reading section. There are charts and graphs in the math section. And there are questions about, the actual charts and graphs themselves in all three of those sections. And so the way that the SAT derives that analysis in science cross-test score is just based on those questions that appear all throughout the SAT. So in some sense, it's kind of like they took the ACT science section, chopped it up, and kind of sprinkled it all over the whole SAT. And then they go back and sort of collect your score from all those questions anyway. So it is true that, there's still not quite as much science or science type questions on the SAT because those charts and graphs are often not quite so sciencey on the SAT. They're not always about observations and experimental setups. They're often just here's a chart of GDP over time or something in the context of a passage or in the context of a social science passage or something like that. But the fundamental skills that are being tested overlap pretty dramatically. And you're certainly not going to get away from doing a whole bunch of chart and graph interpretation by taking the SAT. So while this is kind of a minor difference between the two exams, I don't think it rises to the level of a major difference. It's certainly not as big of a difference as, for example, we talked about in the math section a little bit ago. To me, it's not that big of a factor in determining which of these exams is the right exam to take, because again, there's a lot of similarities, even though there is no section on the SAT that perfectly corresponds to the ACT science section. So when it comes to this, right, if you're trying to prepare for the ACT science section in particular, probably the best advice I can give here is to focus on scientific thinking as opposed to scientific facts, right? There is a style of rigorously logical thinking, right, that the scientific method represents, and really understanding that and how it works and the sort of implications of it for things like control of variables or experimental design, that's going to be important. That stuff really matters when it comes to doing well on this section. Again, much more so than memorizing all the steps in photosynthesis or something like that. Okay, the last section on the ACT is the essay. This is an optional essay, and it has become increasingly optional over the past several years. When the optional essays first came out on the ACT and the SAT, virtually every college out there either required them or very strongly recommended that students submit essay scores as part of their applications. That has changed. That is not the case any longer. There are plenty of schools that sincerely do not seem to care whether you submit an essay score or not. That is not universally true. For example, the University of California schools still require essay scores off the SAT or the ACT, but they're kind of more the exception rather than the rule at this point. So students can certainly, decide whether or not they want to submit, an essay when taking the ACT or the SAT. I would recommend that they do at least a little bit of research first, looking at sort of the requirements of perhaps some of the colleges that they're interested in applying to, particularly if they are seniors. But even if you're a junior, right, it's not all that likely that things will change too dramatically between this year and next, and so it's worth spending a few minutes, sort of looking that up. Of course, if you, on your practice exams or in the lead up to taking the exam, if you are scoring really well on the essay, it would be very silly not to take it, right? If you can get a good score on it, then you should opt in. Why not? It's only for students that are struggling a little more on that, or who feel like their time might be better spent preparing for the other sections of the exam or raising their score in those sections, that you might consider opting out of doing the essay. That said, if you are planning to do the essay, or if you intend to, it's pretty different on the ACT and the SAT. And so it's worth kind of exploring those differences and the differences in sort of the task that you will be faced with. So we can see right here on the ACT that the goal is to evaluate multiple points of view, generate an analysis based on that. So kind of what does that look like? Well, here's a sample prompt. This comes directly from the ACT website. And you can see it's maybe a paragraph or so about, in this case, sort of a general, almost like philosophical problem or thing that we kind of have to think about. In this case, it's about the rise of robotics and kind of automation technology, and what are the sort of the costs and benefits of that, right? What are the pluses and minuses that comes with the prevalence of intelligent machines? So your job as a student is to kind of do two things, right? You have to analyze these given perspectives. And for a lot of students, this is maybe their favorite part of the ACT essay, because it feels familiar, right? They give you something and you just have to think about that thing. You don't have to necessarily say what you think or come up with your own perspective yet. For the first portion of the essay, your job is to analyze the given perspectives, which is nice that they kind of give you these things or give you these samples. However, that is not the entire prompt. The next part of it is to state and develop your own perspective on the issue, and then explain the relationship between your perspective and the given perspectives. And this is the part where I think lots and lots of students struggle or find it challenging. This is the part that students don't like as much, at least in my experience. They don't mind the analyze and evaluate the given perspectives. They don't like nearly as much the state and develop your own perspective on the issue. Now, while it does say here that technically your perspective may be in full agreement with any of the others, in other words, you can just take perspective 3 and say, yeah, I think that one's right, or that's my perspective too, I would suggest that it's a lot harder to write a good essay in that case, because you won't have a lot to say as you go into the second half of your essay that you won't have already said in analyzing that sample perspective. So my suggestion would be that in general, students are going to want to do either the in partial agreement or wholly different perspectives, which again, kind of adds a layer of challenge, at least for some students. So you can see here kind of the breakdown, right, where the first portion of your answer, or the first portion of the task, let's say, is analysis on its own. That's the part that I think the vast majority of students will be comfortable with. The opinion plus analysis part that comes next is perhaps a little bit more challenging for some students. My sort of tip here when it comes to essay practice is to actually practice writing essays. I know it sounds crazy, but it really is important. I see lots and lots of students who think that, look, all I want to do is kind of think about my essay, right? And once I kind of think of the ideas and maybe organize them, the act of writing the essay itself, it's just drudgery, it's just busy work, it's not a big deal. And I think that dramatically underestimates how much work goes into turning an outline into an essay, particularly the sort of sparse or quick outline that students are often in the habit of doing for, standardized exams or things when they're under time pressure. And so, yeah, I think if you do this a couple of times, right, if you write a full essay and kind of compare it to your outline, I think you will find quite frequently that no, you didn't get nearly as much out of creating the outline as you did of kind of writing the entire essay and then going back and looking at it or having it scored or evaluating it. So it is time consuming. It is not perhaps the most fun part of preparing for these exams, but it is nonetheless important that you actually write out your essays and not just bullet points or outlines. All right, so we kind of gone through a bunch of stuff here about the ACT. Let's kind of sum up what are some of the the big reasons that you might want to take the ACT. What would push you in the direction of choosing the ACT as the right exam for you? Probably the biggest one is a particular strength at geometry, right? That is one of the major differences between the ACT and the SAT is just how much more geometry is tested on the former exam. If that suits you, if that fits you, then yeah, that should be a strong lean towards the ACT. Assuming that you are planning to write the essay of whichever exam you end up taking, if you really like or prefer that ACT essay task, maybe you're a really opinionated person or you like that kind of argumentative, persuasive style that the second half of the ACT essay calls for, then yeah, that could be a really good reason to sort of move towards the ACT. The last difference that I didn't emphasize as much as we went through the ACT section, but is definitely there, is just speed, right? The ACT tends to give you substantially less time per question than the SAT does. And if you are comfortable working at that pace or working quickly like that, then the ACT could be a very good fit for you. Another question we get a lot is whether the ACT is the easier test. That's going to depend on the student, to be perfectly honest, right? I mean, if you're a student who really hates geometry and struggled with it, then probably not, right? Because all those geometry questions are going to throw you off and they just don't show up on the SAT. But it doesn't really matter. Fundamentally, you want to do better than all of your peers. And colleges are able to translate between SAT and ACT scores and vice versa. So if one of the tests ends up being easier, then that will be reflected in the translation to the other score scale, right? So there's no, you can think of it kind of like if you were in school and your teacher gives you 2 essay prompts. When I was in high school, quite frequently my English teacher would hand out 2 essay prompts and 90% of the class would write one of them because it just felt so much easier, or because it just seemed so much easier to answer. And quite often the actual best strategy was to write the harder one, not because you were going to end up with a better essay overall, but because compared to the other 3 people that wrote on the hard essay topic, it was a lot easier to stand out. It was a lot easier to impress or to get a good grade. And you can kind of think of these in a similar fashion, right? Because they translate, because the sort of increased or decreased difficulty level is not really that relevant. I would also argue that honestly, the differences in difficulty between the 2 exams is not that great anyway. But even if it is for you, right, it's still not that big a deal. In general, we recommend that you take a practice test of each, right, and look at your performance. And if it's way better on one or the other, then go with that exam. If it's broadly similar, then you want to start thinking about some of the factors that we've been talking about in terms of the differences between the 2 exams. All right, so we've gone through the ACT. Let's now talk about the corresponding sections on the SAT. So we'll start off with our basics, right? You get a score out of 800 for English. You get a score out of 800 for math on the SAT. That adds up to a total, possible number of points of 1,600. Note that on the SAT, that English score includes both your reading and writing multiple choice section scores. Those are broken out into separate, what they call test scores on your score report. But in terms of how, the overall out of 800, it's going to sort of combine those 2 sections. It's not like it used to be where you got 3 separate scores out of 800. The essay is also scored a little bit strangely on the SAT. You will not get an overall essay score at all. You simply get 3 separate scores, each out of 8 for reading, writing, and analysis. And when we analyze the SAT essay prompts, we'll talk a little bit more about how those work. On both exams, there is no guessing penalty. So that means students should answer each and every question, no matter what, or at least each and every multiple choice question, no matter what, even if it's total guess, because you still have a chance when you completely guess of getting the question right. Whereas if you leave it blank, that's literally identical to bubbling in an incorrect answer. And so there's absolutely no downside to guessing if you need to. Timing wise, 3 hours and 50 minutes, a little under 4 hours, very similar between the SAT and the ACT. The first section is, well, not the first section, because you don't necessarily know the order that sections will appear on the SAT. But as we mentioned earlier, right, the math differs between the two exams in terms of sort of the level of math class that it tests up to, right? Another difference is that the SAT has a no calculator math section. That will be quite the challenge for at least some students who do not like doing mental math, who struggle with mental math, or who struggle to do mental math quickly and accurately, right? While you do get a little bit more time per question on the SAT, it's not so extensive that, you know, if you're really struggling to do mental math quickly, that you won't run out. You very easily can. Another point is just that the math on the SAT is a little bit different in terms of the types of questions asked. On the ACT in general, if you recognize a question, if you sort of remember doing a question like that in math class in school or on your homework or something, it is very likely that the question on the ACT will be solved the same way or similarly. In other words, the ACT is often a test on recognition, whereas the SAT, a lot of times they ask the questions in a slightly different way, or they require a little bit of a deduction or a little bit of understanding before you get to the part that feels totally practiced and natural and like you've done a million times before. So that's what we mean by an emphasis on problem solving, or the sort of depth of the types of questions on the SAT. Of course, if you're going to take the SAT, practicing your mental math becomes essential. Here you see the breakdown of math topics on the SAT. This goes back to that point I was making about geometry and its representation on the two exams, where it's much, much less on the SAT than it is on the ACT, and that's where they get room on the SAT to include that passport to advanced math set of questions. So what that implies then is that it's very important that you think about your math schedule as a student. When are you actually signed up to take pre-calculus? When are you actually going to be done, you know, learning all the stuff in trigonometry? If that's going to be after you're signed up to take the SAT, that's a problem, right? You certainly don't want to walk in and take an SAT without having learned at some point from someone all of the math on that exam, or that you're likely to be tested on, right? What that means is that it's generally wise to be done with pre-calculus by the end of your sophomore year, if at all possible. I recognize that that's hard, right? That's certainly not the math schedule that every student is on. It's not even the math schedule that I was on when I was in high school, and I was, you know, doing pretty well in that. It just wasn't as essential based on the way that the standardized tests were designed then. But now, with many students who want to take the SAT at some point during their junior years, right, you want to be totally done with pre-calculus when you do that. Well, if you're in pre-calculus as a junior, right, unless you're going to take it, you know, in the summer after your junior year of high school, you won't have, again, completed all of the math material that you could be potentially tested on. Now, of course, there's ways around that, right? You can try and accelerate your math over a summer by taking summer school, or by going to community college, or by coming to C2. But, you know, if not, then you want to really think about your math schedule and how it sort of plays into those dates in terms of knowing your dates and making that sort of overall testing plan that we talked about at the beginning of the webinar. Here we see a couple of sample problems from the College Board website. These are just sort of the types of math questions that show up on the SAT. I included them to try and give a sense for the difference, right, or the challenge that SAT math problems sometimes pose. Particularly, you know, again, it's not so much that these questions are impossible, but that they're not the same way that these questions are generally posed, right? In general, in math, if you see a third degree function like that, you're just going to set it equal to 0 and find x. That's going to be the right thing to do. Well, here you cannot do that, right? Without some other deduction or thinking about something else, or sort of noticing something in the problem, you can't do that until you know the value of c, right? And that's actually what the question is asking. And so it requires a little bit more, you know, thinking before you can figure out how to solve that question. Also got this this kind of geometry problem, right? That involves a whole bunch of individual steps, none of which is so hard individually, but coming up with all of them and then doing them quickly and accurately, and then spotting that little trick at the end where you have to convert from volume back to mass, right? that can be challenging for lots of students, even if every individual step is not that hard, right? Lots of students can find the area of a hexagon, lots of students can turn that into a volume, lots of students can find the volume of a cylinder and subtract, but being able to do all of those things in the right order, correctly and quickly, can sort of amp up the challenge level when it comes to SAT math. All right, the next section is the English section. This is your sort of multiple choice, grammar, and expression of ideas or rhetorical strategies type questions. I'm going to go very quickly here because it is almost identical to the ACT, with the only difference being the charts and graphs that show up throughout the SAT that we talked about when we talked about the ACT science section, right? So yes, there will be charts and graphs here, but otherwise it will be pretty much the same as the section on the ACT. In fact, if you are kind of running short on material with which to practice for these exams, you can certainly use material that will help you prepare for the ACT to prepare for the SAT and vice versa, right? The sections are so similar, the concepts tested are basically identical, and so the material crosses over very, very nicely. Here you can see some sample questions. Again, I don't think there's any big surprises here, but you can see that, you know, there is a chunk of the passage underlined that has to do with the chart or the graph there, and you have to be able to read that graph and then edit that sentence so that it is not only grammatically accurate, but also that it is, you know, quantitatively accurate, right? That it does reflect the information found in that chart. All right, so then we get to the English section. This is your reading section here. Again, highly similar to the corresponding section on the ACT, with the major difference just being the amount of time students get per question in this portion of the exam. There are no sentence completions on either the SAT or the ACT. Both exams test vocabulary in context, which we'll look at on the next page here. And of course, there are charts and graphs in the reading section as well. So this is just an aside, right? This is not a difference between the two exams because, again, this is the way that vocabulary is tested on the ACT, but it does impact the way that I think students should study for this because, as you can see here, this is not the world's fanciest word that we're testing the definition of, right? Intense is not some tricky 17-syllable word that only college professors ever use. It's a pretty normal word, but it's a word that can be used in a variety of different ways. And if you can't tell specifically which way it's being used as in this passage here, that's where you're going to have trouble, right? And so students who simply memorize one-word definitions of tricky words, maybe based on flashcards, for example, are going to have trouble with these types of vocabulary questions. You have to learn your vocabulary a little bit more holistically, a little bit more generally speaking from reading, as opposed to from the sort of flashcard memorization style that was quite popular several years ago, right? So we can see here that if you just go with your sort of primary definition of intense or the sort of first word that pops into your head, it's very possible that students will pick answer choice A here. They will pick emotional. You know, I think of intense as kind of being fiery or passionate, right? And that fits pretty neatly with emotional. But if you actually read the passage, we can see that intense is talking about a clustering here of a smaller number, of stuff in a smaller number of bigger cities. In other words, things are getting packed together more tightly, more densely. And that is much closer to the word concentrated than it is to the word emotional, right? And so again, if you are just going off those one-word definitions, you're likely to struggle on at least the vocab type questions in the reading sections of these exams. It means that reading challenging material as a means of preparing for these types of questions becomes increasingly important. I did mention there is one kind of different type of passage that shows up on the SAT reading section. That's called the founding documents or global conversation passage. It is certainly a minor thing to consider when choosing between these exams. You can see a sample of it here. And you know, this is from a speech that a congressperson gave during the Nixon impeachment hearings, but the founding documents means pretty much anything in US history is fair game, going all the way back to things like the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence. And then the global conversation part of it means that really anything is fair game if it's from something having to do with what we might think of as things like human rights or democracy, or stuff like that. So it could easily be a speech from someone like Nelson Mandela, or someone like Gandhi, who is associated with a fight for freedom and rights and or democracy. in his or her country, even if it's not specific to the United States. That said, that type of passage, can be pretty challenging, especially for students who don't necessarily know a whole lot about the U.S. government, how it functions. Maybe if you haven't taken AP U.S. history or U.S. government, it might be a very, very minor reason to lean towards the ACT, right? Just as a quick test of yourself, could you define those terms below? Maybe, then great. Or if you feel like, yeah, no problem, excellent, then that's certainly not a reason to avoid the SAT. But for at least some students, that could certainly be a challenge. Okay. Lastly, I promise we're getting close to wrapping up here, folks, is the essay on the SAT. And this is one that is entirely analytical. So it's the other area that I would argue is a major difference between the SAT and the ACT, because it's not that hybrid task that the ACT essay is. Instead, it's the whole task that the student faces is to analyze a given passage. The test taker or the test makers will provide you with that, and your job is just to analyze it. You don't have to bring in outside information. You don't have to bring in examples. For students who are taking or have taken AP Language, the second essay on the AP Language exam is basically identical to this, right? It's almost the same language in the prompt. It's the exact same style of question. And so if you are taking or have taken that class, it's very likely that you've practiced this kind of essay a lot. And even if you have trouble with it or you find it difficult, you should know what to do, right? You should know how to approach it or sort of what is expected, even if that is difficult to produce. As we said before, there's no overall essay score. You get those 3 scores, one for reading, in other words, how well did you understand the included passage, one for writing, how good is your essay itself in terms of things like grammar and organization and the quality of your prose, and then one for analysis, right? How good are your thoughts about what you have read, or how good is your analysis of the included passage? And as I mentioned earlier, right, this essay is optional, while there are a few exceptions, particularly the University of California, that still require that applying students submit essay scores. So here we see the sample path, the sample prompt. This will never change. This prompt is always the same on every single administration of the SAT. The only thing that changes is the included text, right? The included source text. And one thing that I think is really nice about this is that they actually include the author's claim in the prompt. They tell you what the source text is arguing. All your job is to analyze and explain how the author is persuasive, how the author convinces the reader that he or she is correct, right? And again, that should feel familiar if you are used to taking those AP Language exams. Here you see a sample prompt from the 2012 AP Lang exam, and it's basically the same thing, right? It's write an essay in which you analyze the rhetorical strategies that the author uses to achieve his purpose, persuade his audience, etc. What that means is that if you're looking to practice this, the College Board has provided a gazillion sample prompts, not in the SAT section, right? But in the AP Language page. You can go back and you can download the FRQs dating back years. I cut this image off at 2013. I promise you it goes back even earlier than that, right? So there's literally decades of practice prompts that you can use to help you prepare to write a good SAT essay. So what are our big takeaways here, right? Big differences between these exams: the math section, the essay, and the amount of time per question that students get. More minor differences are the way in which science or quantitative interpretation is tested on the 2 exams, both in terms of it being one section of its own on the ACT, and in terms of kind of the nature of the material itself, as well as that great global conversation passage on the reading section of the SAT. So broadly speaking, the exams are similar, but there are definitely some differences that will make a difference for at least some of you students out there. So I'll quickly sort of skim through just a summary of what we've covered here in terms of the similarities and differences between the SAT and the ACT. I'm not going to read out this whole chart because that would be highly repetitive. But as you can see here in general, as you compare each section, there's going to be a lot of similarities. Naturally, the scoring systems are different, but in terms of timing, types of questions, and a guessing penalty or lack thereof, they're almost identical. English section, very similar, other than time per question. Math section is one of our areas with some pretty reasonable differences in terms of the geometry versus passport to advanced math. Reading section, highly similar. Vocabulary tested in the same way. Variety of passage types, although there is that founding US document / global conversation passage on the SAT. And then we have the difference between the two science sections, or between the way that science is tested on the two exams as one of our other minor differences. Finally, the essay, quite different, and one where at least some students will likely prefer the SAT version of it because it is that sort of self-contained, only analyze the given prompt or the given essay versus the ACT, where you do have to eventually come up with your own perspective and argue for it. So that's how you make that decision. Of course, we mentioned earlier taking a practice test of both as one of the sort of guiding lights of at least initially choosing. And then if your scores are similar, which for most students they will be because these exams are pretty similar, right? Then you start thinking about those differences between the two exams and which exam they might push you towards. Of course, C2 can help, right? We've got great teachers. When teachers come into C2 for the very first time, they don't get interviewed. They certainly don't get to talk to any students, right? The first thing that we generally do is we make them take a test. We make them sometimes take more than one if they want to teach a whole bunch of different subjects, but we certainly make them take an ACT or an SAT if that's what they're going to be teaching. Notice that they have to score in the top 5% of all test takers. Doesn't matter how they did in high school or how they did in college. I mean, we want them to do well, but it's more important that they be able to do it now still, right? And only once they hit those benchmarks, only once they demonstrate that they can still do extremely well as test takers themselves, only then do we interview them, do we train them, do we put them through a whole bunch of stuff before they're finally allowed to work with our students. And so I think that speaks to the quality of the instruction that you are likely to get should you come into C2. Of course, we can also help you plan, right? We've helped a gazillion students, as I mentioned earlier. That is a real number, I promise, look it up. And those students, have given us a lot of experience in terms of how long these things take and how to approach these things and how to design a good study plan that both accounts for the students' weaknesses and makes sure they're ready to take the test on the date that they have selected or the date that they've planned for. And of course, we have, we can build in backup plans and all that stuff that we talked about earlier in terms of becoming a good test taker. So if you are interested in having C2 reach out to you, I would encourage you to just submit your name, your zip code, and either a phone number or an email address as a question in that Q&A pod. I will make sure that whatever C2 is closest to you reaches out at the close of the webinar. Otherwise, we'll maybe take a question or two here before we wrap things up. So let me look over and see if there are any particularly good ones or, oh yeah, so here's a couple of interesting questions. One is, if you take multiple SATs or ACTs, you can choose which to send over to a college, right? And it's not quite as simple as that. To some extent, yes, depending on the college. So basically what you were referring to are things like score choice. Some colleges promise to only look at your very best score. Some colleges will even let you kind of split up different times when you've taken the SAT and sort of take your math grade from this exam and your English grade from that exam and combine those two into your overall score. Other colleges are going to want to know more and are not necessarily just going to take the very best score or where let you simply choose. So that's something where you want to do a little bit of research because again, it will differ a little bit from college to college potentially before making that decision. Okay, maybe take one more question. So here's a question that I think a lot of students have and that I think includes a misconception, so I think it's worth clarifying. A lot of schools only require one test to be submitted. Which test would you recommend entering? Obviously the one you scored better on, but which one is more impressive? And that's one of the points I hope I made, but if not, let me reiterate it more strongly here. There is no preference between the ACT and the SAT There is no, this one is more prestigious or this one is more impressive. Colleges do not care. They view them as substitutes for one another. In other words, you're absolutely right. You only need to submit one. So if you've gotten a really good SAT score already, you do not need to, by any means, take the ACT. You are done with those two tests once you get a great score on one of them. And at that point, you are much better off spending your time doing something like preparing for an SAT subject test or preparing for an AP exam or working on an extracurricular activity or any number of other things, right? So, two-part question there. One is, it doesn't matter. Whichever one you can do better on, whichever one you can score better on, that's the one that you should take. That's the one that you should submit. But there is no like, oh, these colleges prefer the SAT or those colleges prefer the ACT. That is simply no longer the case. Okay, thank you all so much for coming. Have wonderful evenings and good night.